I think the takeaway of this episode is everyone should strive to be a polymath. Just because you're a programmer, there's no reason that you can't learn enough about art to embarrass yourself in a YouTube series that 100 people watch. So today's video comes with a bit of a disclaimer, and that is I'm a programmer, I'm not an artist, and I'm going to be talking about art, which is not really something that I know that much about, so this is not intended to be an instructional video. This isn't meant to be really, you're not going to learn much about anything from watching this. This is mostly just sort of me as a programmer making programmer art, explaining some of the steps that I've been through on the past few games, and what I've learned from that, and how I'm applying those lessons to Gunmetal Arcadia. So, I guess going back to, you have to win the game, since that was sort of where this whole pixel art thing kind of started for me. In that game I was working with a very, very limited 4-color palette and a different resolution that kind of required the sprites to be very, very small, and I could fudge it a little bit. I could get away with just having a few pixels move, and that was enough to sort of evoke a walk cycle, or evoke, jumping or clinging to walls, or whatever else the character was doing. When I started making Super Win the Game, I was using the NES color palette. And I've talked a little bit about that before. The NES color palette has like 50, 54, 56 colors, and sprites typically will have 3 colors each, because 1 color is reserved for transparency. So I was trying to play, within those limitations, but also take what I had done in You Have to Win the Game and make something that looked like a successor to that. I was also trying to take, familiar, recognizable elements of NES games, and of course Zelda 2 is the one that most people recognize when they first start playing Super Win, but there are elements of Metroid and Super Mario Bros. 3 and Kirby's Adventure and all these other games that I tried to bring in there. And I guess sort of what I discovered on that game was it was really hard to take all of those sort of disparate elements and make them gel together into something that looked like any sort of coherent Super Win the Game art style. So with Gunmetal Arcadia, I'm sort of taking a step back, looking at the entire library of NES games and asking what worked and what didn't. The NES games I tend to feel had the strongest sense of a really coherent art style were the ones that limited every sprite and every 16x16 tile to a single hue. Since they would only have 3 or 4 colors that they could use for every sprite or tile, there are some games, and I think Castlevania is a good example. Some games would take, colors from all across the palette and mash them together. You would see sprites that had maybe gray mixed with orange and blue, and it had a distinct look. I think Castlevania does have a strong aesthetic across all of those games, but I don't necessarily think that it plays to the NES's strengths very well. When I look at games like Faxanadu or Zelda 2, as much as I hate to always lean on that one example, games where every sprite and every tile was limited to a single hue and just had multiple values of that hue, those tended, in my opinion, to create the strongest, most coherent, well-composed scenes. So that's where I'm starting for Gunmetal Arcadia, is I'm saying, okay, I've already built technology, and I've talked about this in past blog posts. I built technology that I can do, palette swapping on sprites and tiles, so it's easier to abstract the content of that art from the colors that I use to draw it. So I can take a step back and say, okay, let's talk about the palettes I'm going to use for this game. And in general, those are going to be single hues. When you look at the NES color palette, the way it's typically laid out, you'll see it sort of goes across the entire spectrum and has values from brightest to darkest, or darkest brightest, whatever. It doesn't really have any options for low saturation colors. Everything is sort of full saturation, and that's why so many NES games have very bright, cartoony art styles, is that's what the NES is capable of producing. I'm trying to avoid leaning too heavily on grays because those don't really mesh well with anything else. So unless a character is just going to be entirely gray, like for instance a statue or a ghost or something that makes sense to be gray, I don't want to try to mix gray with other colors because they don't really mesh well together. So I'm looking at how I can, play that as a strength and look at taking characters in Gunmetal Arcadia, characters that might not necessarily logically be drawn in, bright reds or purples or greens. But I'm saying, okay, for the sake of this game, for the sake of having well-composed scenes where the sprites really pop off the background, let's take this, turret that spits slime and make it bright purple, because why not? It's a video game, and it's gonna look like a video game. As I was reviewing some of my old art style notes from like last November or December, I saw I had one note where I was talking about, okay, so I'm going to be sticking to a single hue for every color palette, but maybe I could shift the darker colors a little bit cooler and shift the brighter colors a little bit warmer and still maintain the appearance of a single hue, but just make it look a little bit richer and more vibrant. And it's funny that I had written that so long ago. Just within the last couple of weeks or months maybe, I was playing around with palettes one day, and I finally actually put that into practice, and I was happy to see it worked exactly as I was imagining. It it still maintained the appearance of like a single primary hue. You could look at the background and say, oh, that's green bricks, or that's blue walls or whatever. But maybe the highlights were a little bit more yellow, maybe the shadows were a little bit more purple, and it really just livened up the scene, made it a little bit richer, and that's so that's something I've been keeping in my mind now as I start figuring out what different palettes I'm going to be using for this game going into the future. But yeah, I was happy to see that turned out as I was hoping it would. It's one of those things too where now that I've become consciously aware of that, I start seeing it in other games I'm playing, and I'm like, oh, and it feels so obvious now. And I'm sure every artist watching this right now is like, duh, that's so simple, it's like art 101 stuff, but I'm a programmer. Because the other thing that I've been doing with my tiles is I've been trying to do more with the desert shading. That was something that Faxanadu did really well. I kind of gave it a little bit of a grim, dark, gritty look, at least as much as the NES was capable of. But because everything did adhere so much to a single hue for every tile, it didn't fall into that just sort of noisiness that Castlevania did. I want to have that dithered shading, but necessarily the game is going to have to look a little bit cartoony, just because I am using those very bright, vibrant colors, and also just the way that I've drawn my characters, the way that I tend to proportion my characters. I have big eyes on my characters, so it makes them look a little bit exaggerated already. And in my opinion, NES games that tried to have more realistically proportioned characters didn't always work very well. I don't think that was the NES's strong suit. So, it is going to have to be a little cartoony. And to go off on a little bit of a tangent there, in the very, very early days of Gunmetal Arcadia, I was actually thinking of taking things very, very far to the extreme of being cartoony, and I have some I have some footage here of back when I was playing around with what a character might look like with really, really exaggerated proportions, just like a gigantic head on top of a little body with little stubby arms and legs. And I think it actually worked fairly well. The jumping animation feels really cool and really expressive, but it wasn't the game that I was trying to make. So I reeled that in a little bit, ended up with a character that's proportioned closer to the characters in the games that I'm, most trying to evoke. Games like Zelda 2 and the Battle of Olympus. And Faxanadu and Castlevania and so many others. So I guess in trying to find the right balance of cartoony to realistic, one of the things I've been thinking about is, like, should characters have strong borders? I knew for sure I didn't want to have black borders on characters. Some NES games pulled that off really well. Super Mario Bros. 3 is a good example. Mario does have a black border all the time. Well, I guess not when he's Fire Mario, but most of the time he has a black border, and it works really well because that game has a very strong cartoony look with just like very, very simple flat colors everywhere. But that's not the aesthetic of Gunmetal Arcadia. And I think in Super Win the Game I found that didn't always look the way I had hoped it would. So I'm definitely avoiding black borders. I'm doing a little bit with, darker colors of the same hue and doing some borders with that, but I'm not really like making that a strict requirement. I'm only doing that where it's really necessary to sort of evoke the shapes and outlines of characters. As long as I'm talking about art, I should talk a little bit about animation too. Animation is probably more than anything else. It's the one biggest weakness I have in game development. I can hack music, I can hack pixel art. A lot of those things I can get away with doing a pretty good job, and animation is something where I just, not only do I not have any formal training there, I know so little that I'm really just sort of fumbling my way through that. And I've been making an effort to try to teach myself more with animation, reading up on books, the Animator's Survival Kit and stuff like that, and trying to learn what makes an effective walk cycle, what makes a good jump. And between looking at that sort of reference material, which obviously tends to be focused more on like film and TV animation as opposed to video games, but the same concepts tend to apply. Between looking at stuff like that and looking at reference material from other games that had really, really good expressive animation, I'm pretty happy with what I have so far. The walk cycle that I have for Vario and his jumping animations, it's really clicking, and I have, the first time I saw the new sprite sheet in the game and had the character walking around, I was like, it feels like a unique character. It no longer feels like a paint over of Link. It doesn't feel like Link wearing different clothes. It feels like I've created this new believable video game character, and that's really cool, and that makes me want to do more with animation in the future. So hopefully I can continue to level up my animation skills there, and as always, feel free to send me any feedback. If there's any obvious mistakes that I'm making, I'm happy to hear those. I guess going back to the idea that I'm a programmer and whatever art I make is programmer art. That's kind of a weird thing, because I do want my art to look good, but I don't have any formal art training. Everything I know is what I've taught myself, essentially. But I guess programmer art can be production art. I think really the trick is just to be able to look critically at your work, understand where your flaws are, and I think most of us do understand where our flaws are. It's just a question of whether or not our egos will let us hand wave that way, or whether we try to fix those and try to get better. I can point to a zillion things I would have done differently in Super Win the Game if I had had more time, and I didn't. With Gunmetal Arcadia, I'm trying to not only still maintain a fast production schedule with the limited time that I have, but I'm also trying as much as I can to make sure that I don't have really big flaws that are going to be embarrassing when I'm showing that game a year after it's launched. Well, as always, if you're enjoying this series, please like and subscribe. Of course, you can leave feedback below the video. You can also contact me on Twitter or on Nest.fm. My username is Pirate Hearts on both those. I also do have a Patreon page. If you're enjoying this series or my development blogs posted at gunmetalarcadia.com, please consider supporting my Patreon so I can continue producing this content in the future. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.